Let's talk about fiat. Fiat is a Latin term that means let it be done. And it's another way of saying that the affirmative team only has to prove that the federal government should do something, not that the federal government will do something. And there's a world of difference between those two words. And as you may recall from the resolution video, the only word in the resolution that does not limit affirmative ground is the word should. Because should implies that we ought to do something, not that we would, will, or could. Here's an example. Imagine a debate about whether you should eat a healthy dinner versus a debate about whether you will eat a healthy dinner. The should debate focuses on research evidence, what's best for your body, and whether healthy eating is generally more advantageous or disadvantageous. And the will debate focuses on whether you will, would, or could eat a healthy dinner tonight. In the world of debate, all resolutions talk about what the federal government should do. And this is where the affirmative gets to rise above politics and the president and the Congress and whether they're getting along. Instead of having to prove that current political leaders will do something, the affirmative team only has to prove that they should do something. It comes as no surprise that our federal leaders in Washington often have a difficult time getting things done, and it doesn't really matter who is at fault or why we have such gridlock. The fact remains that because of all the political infighting, good ideas from both political parties often get trapped in the process and never become law. This isn't just true for this decade, it's been happening since the start of our democracy. And in the world of policy debate, we have an affirmative team trying to pass a policy and a negative team trying to prove why that policy isn't a good idea. This creates a problem for the affirmative team, because even if all the leaders in Washington were getting along, there are still lots of legislative bumps in the road that might keep a good idea from becoming a law. And a good negative team could easily respond to an affirmative plan by simply pointing out all of the realistic ways in which their plan wouldn't actually be passed by the Senate, House, and President. This isn't really fair to the affirmative team because the affirmative team should only be responsible for proving whether the federal government should do something, not whether they will, would, or could do something. In other words, the affirmative does not have to solve all of the technical, legislative, or political realities that could realistically prevent a plan from passing. They only need to defend the merits of their idea. This makes fiat one of the most essential and important parts of the debate round. You see, and this is critical to your understanding of debate, neither team should be debating what happens before the affirmative plan is passed into law. Instead, both debate teams should be debating about what happens after the affirmative plan is passed. In other words, both teams are trying to describe the world after the plan is passed. The affirmative team is trying to prove that the world would be a much better place, and the negative team is trying to prove that the world would be a much worse place. Neither team is trying to debate whether the plan itself would actually ever become law. And thus, we say that an affirmative team has the power of fiat, which is our way of saying that the affirmative team is protected from any negative arguments about the likelihood that this legislation or affirmative plan will pass. To better understand this concept, let's introduce a couple of debate terms you might hear during a fiat debate: pre-fiat and post-fiat. These aren't commonly used terms, but understanding them helps you understand debate in general. If fiat is the point at which the judge signs the ballot to reject or accept the affirmative plan, then pre-fiat is everything that happens before the ballot is signed, and post-fiat is everything that happens after the ballot is signed. And both teams should be discussing the round from a post-fiat perspective, meaning that they're both describing what life is like after the plan is passed. So if you're the negative team and you read an article that quotes the president as saying he or she would never let the affirmative plan pass into law, you might hear the affirmative team say that's a pre-fiat argument and shouldn't be considered in this round. And if the judge is not an expert in debate, as many of your judges this year will be, then the affirmative team will have to take about 30 seconds to explain what this means so that the judge understands the fiat argument. Let's say our proposed affirmative plan is to ban the PRISM program currently used by the NSA. Consider the following negative arguments and see if you can figure out which arguments would be protected by fiat and which arguments would be fair game in the round. Number 1, the affirmative plan would result in an increase in terrorism. Number 2, our government would never pass a plan like this because they love PRISM. Number 3, the NSA would put political pressure on our elected leaders to prevent this affirmative plan from passing. 4, if this plan passed, we would have to hire tens of thousands of intelligence officers to do the work that PRISM does. It would never work. Which arguments do you think the affirmative team would have to defend, and which could be dismissed by the affirmative under the power of fiat? Here's a hint. Take a look at the arguments again and ask yourself whether the argument is based on the likelihood that the plan would be passed or on the outcome of the plan after it is passed. The first argument by the negative team is that the plan would result in an increase in terrorism. And this is something the negative team argues would occur as a result of the plan being passed. So the affirmative team would have to answer this argument. The second argument is that the government wouldn't ever pass this plan. And as true as that might be, the affirmative doesn't have to prove that they would do this, only that they should do this. So the affirmative team can claim fiat for this argument. Claiming fiat is pretty easy. The affirmative team only needs to take a few seconds to explain the should versus would argument and explain why the affirmative team is protected by fiat. The third argument, as you probably guessed, is based on whether the NSA wants this, which again isn't about the outcome of the plan, it's about the likelihood of the plan passing. So the affirmative team is again protected by fiat. The fourth and final argument is that we would have to hire people to replace computers. This is a potentially undesirable outcome that occurs in a post-fiat world, so it's fair game. In other words, the plan passes and then the bad thing happens. Before we finish, let's talk about a couple of gray areas, situations that aren't clearly pre- or post-fiat. What if the proposed affirmative plan violates an international treaty that Congress ratified decades ago? On the one hand, that's a pretty valid argument that should be a legitimate concern. On the other hand, it's an argument focused on a pre-existing and pre-fiat treaty. Or what about the argument that we don't have enough money to pass this plan? In both cases, these are issues that are problematic before the ballot is signed, so they're technically pre-fiat issues. However, the negative team can still make arguments about what happens in a post-fiat world after the plan is passed. So, for example, maybe violating the treaty hurts our relationship with other countries and prevents us from passing a very important trade agreement. Or maybe the cost of the program is so great that we would suffer an international credit downgrade. Now, both of these disadvantages occur after the plan is passed, so they're fair game for the negative team. Let's give one last example that lets us tickle two monkeys with one stick. We know that our political parties don't get along, which means that in the real world they probably wouldn't pass a plan like this. That's an argument clearly covered by fiat, so it's not an acceptable negative argument. But however, the negative could argue that passing the plan would use up the last remaining bit of cooperative bipartisanship that remains between the two parties. And because the two parties would then no longer have the spirit of compromise, they won't pass a really important agriculture bill that's scheduled for debate next month. And what do you know? The impact of not passing the agriculture bill is far worse than the impact of not passing the affirmative. So the basis of the politics disadvantage is that passing the affirmative plan forces one political party to become so politically weak that they can't pass some upcoming important piece of legislation. And the disadvantage of not passing that legislation far outweighs any benefit derived or gained from passing the affirmative plan. This sort of disadvantage is known as a politics disadvantage, and it's based on the idea that there's only so much love in Washington. And passing the affirmative plan uses up all that love and prevents us from passing a much more important plan in the future. So let's summarize. Whether it's violating international treaties, hurting our economy, or disrupting the political capital of an entire political party, the affirmative plan does have implications for a post-fiat world. And good negative teams can usually take pre-fiat arguments and parlay them into post-fiat disadvantages, like the economy collapsing. The key is to keep the debate focused on what happens after the plan is passed. Now it's time for some key review words. Make sure you understand them and review any portion of the video you didn't quite understand. Fiat, should versus would, pre-fiat, post-fiat, politics disadvantage, political capital. That's all for now. Good luck, debaters.